Hello, everyone. Mr. Sutherland here, continuing our last section of the year. It's our last method of solving quadratic. So if I take us back to the very beginning here, where we started shortly after we began e-learning here, it says April 13th, so middle of April. Our goal this chapter has been to solve different quadratic equations. We started by solving by graphing, and we would find the x and y intercepts, or excuse me, the x-intercepts, graph it, and those were the zeros. We then solve by factoring, and the last thing we've been working on is solving with square roots. And so the final method that we're going to use is we're going to use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is a method that works for any quadratic function, whether it can be factored or not. No matter what the quadratic is, the quadratic formula will always give you the correct answers. So it always works. Factoring doesn't always work. Methods of square roots don't always work. Quadratic formula is the algebraic method that will always work. So here is the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula really just gives you a guide to follow in order to solve a quadratic equation. So here's what it says. If ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So notice I have to have this in standard form on the left side, and on the right side, in order to use quadratic formula, this has to be 0. If that is true, then here is my answer. X equals the opposite of b. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So what you have to do is identify what are a, b, and c, and then you just plug into this formula and simplify, and that'll give you the answers for a quadratic equation. So let's start with one that we could do another way, and then we can see that the quadratic formula gives us the exact same answer. And then we'll look at some examples, probably two examples, where you have to use the quadratic formula in order to come up with the answer. So, example one, we're going to solve the equation x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Okay. The first method we're going to use is let's solve by, we'll call this A, let's solve by factoring. So this is what we were doing on the last quiz. This is something that factors. If I list my my multiples of 5, my factors of 5, right? I have 1 and 5. 1 plus 5 is 6, so I know that this factors into x plus 5 times x plus 1. Then we know that x plus 5 equals 0, or x plus 1 equals 0. So we get x equals negative 5, or x equals negative 1. So this one can be solved by factoring. Now, let's see how the quadratic formula works for this one. To be honest, it's more work than what it's worth, but it shows you how the formula works. Most of the time, we're going to use quadratic formula with problems that we have to use it for, not examples like this where it's not necessary. So I start with x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify what is A, what is B, what is C. So A is the number that's with the x squared, which is a 1. B is the number with an x, so that's the 6, and C is 5. Now, I am going to plug into our formula. So I do the opposite of B, so I do negative 6 plus or minus the square root of B squared. So 6 squared is 36 minus 4. The A value is 1, the C value is 5, all over 2 times the a value, which is 1. So let's see what happens here. This is -6 plus or minus square root of 36 minus 20 all over 2. So I get -6 plus or minus square root of 16 all over 2. And we know what the square root of 16 is. That's -6 plus or minus 4 over 2. So here's what this means. It means I have two answers. I have -6 plus 4 over 2, or I have x equals -6 minus 4 over 2. Well, -6 plus 4 is -2 divided by 2 is -1. -6 minus 4 is -10 divided by 2 is -5. Notice I get the same two answers. So this method always works. Would we use it when it's something that we can necessarily factor? Not always, but sometimes we don't realize it can be factored or not, but the quadratic formula always works. Just make sure you have it in standard form and you have it equal to 0. So let's do two examples. All right. So example 2. Solve each of these by using the quad formula. So the first one, let's do x squared plus 3x minus 6 equals 0. The second one, let's do x squared plus x equals 5. All right, so for A is in standard form. It's set equal to 0. So now I can identify everything that I need. We have that A is the value with the x squared, which is 1. B is the value with the x, which is 3. C is the constant, which is -6. So now I'm just going to plug into our formula. So I have opposite of B, so -3 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So 3 squared is 9, minus 4, a is 1, c is -6 over 2 times 1. So now I have x is -3 plus or minus the square root of 9. -4 times 1 times -6 actually ends up being plus 24 over 2. And so x is -3 plus or minus square root of 33 over 2. What we have to check for is, can we simplify the square root? And this one cannot be simplified. So this is my final answer. We don't have to write it as two answers. We could write it as -3 plus root 33 all over 2, or -3 minus root 33 all over 2. I'm fine if you just leave it like this. All right, so now, why don't you try B? Pause the video and see how you do with it. Okay, hopefully you've tried it. I'm going to draw this vertical line just to separate our space. Now, the first thing I notice with B is it's not equal to 0, so I can't use the quadratic formula yet. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 5 from both sides. So that would give me x squared plus x minus 5 equals 0. Once I have it equal to 0, now I can use the quadratic formula. A, the number with the x squared is 1. B, the number with the x is also 1, and c is -5. Sorry, I thought I stopped the video and I was going to have to re-record everything. I'm glad I didn't. All right, now let's plug in. So x equals the opposite of b. So -1 plus or minus the square root, b squared. 1 squared is 1, minus 4ac all over 2 times a. So I get x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of 1. -4 times 1 times -5 is plus 20. Remember, order of operations. We're going to do all this multiplying and then add over 2. So I get x equals -1 plus or minus square root of 21 over 2. Now, can I simplify square root of 21? I cannot. So this is your final answer. You could plug that into the calculator and get a decimal answer, but we're just going to focus on having these answers as exact right now. So that's the quadratic formula. It always works. Even when something can be factored, we can always use the quadratic formula and find the zero. As you can see, it's a few more steps. But when something can't be factored, like these two, the quadratic formula will always give you the solutions or the answers to the quadratic equation. And if we were to figure out what these decimals were, and we were to graph these quadratics, we would see that it represents the x-intercept. So what we needed a calculator for in the very first section in order to find the x-intercepts, we now can find exactly. So try the homework, try the problems. I don't give you too many of these because you can see they take a little bit of work as you're going through. Just be careful with your work as you go, and we'll do more with this next time. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.